Today we've got sort of a wild story, and I won't bury the lead here. Newsmax, the right wing cable news network that grew in popularity by peddling false election fraud claims following the 2020 presidential election, secretly lobbied Florida Republicans to pass a new state law attacking companies that rate news organizations based on their accuracy and ethics. This is an insane law. It's basically an attempt to defund fact checking and make it even harder for people to know who they can trust for accurate and good faith information. And of course, Florida is the first state in the country to pass something like this. We're going to go through exactly what they did here, what Newsmax and the Florida legislature did, how we found out about it, and why it matters. But first, just please don't forget to click the like and subscribe buttons and leave a review if you can. Those are the sorts of small things that can help us really sort of grow the show and spread the word. And if you're interested in more content like this, please think about subscribing to our newsletter if you haven't already. The easiest place to find us is at seekingrentsfl.com. That'll redirect you to the Substack link. Subscriptions are free. None of our stories or podcasts are ever behind a paywall, but there is an option to voluntarily pay for a subscription if you've got the means. If you can afford one, we ask that you do think about paying for a subscription. The revenue we get from those voluntary paid subscriptions helps us afford the cost of reporting expenses like public records requests. Hello, and welcome to Seeking Rents, the podcast. I'm your host, Jason Garcia. I am the publisher of Seeking Rents, which is a newsletter in Florida about state politics, but with a particular focus on the ways that big businesses and other special interests influence public policy in this state. That name, Seeking Rents, comes from a term in economics called rent seeking. And rent seeking is what's happening when someone with lots of wealth and influence, like a big business or a billionaire, uses their wealth and influence to get laws changed in their favor in a way that allows them to capture even more wealth and influence for themselves, usually at the expense of someone else. We're going to start today's show with a crash course on how the Florida legislature works, a little legislative 101, if you will. But before you run away screaming, I swear to God, this will be quick. You may have heard this before, but there's only one thing the Florida legislature absolutely has to do every session, and that is pass a state budget. It's the only thing the Constitution requires the Florida legislature to do. They could pass a budget and not do anything else in it, and everything would be fine. But there's actually more to the state budget than just the budget document itself, the like 500-page essentially spreadsheet that's got all the line items in it. Every budget comes with a bunch of different bills that are connected to it. These are sometimes, some of them are known as the implementing bill because they implement parts of the budget. They basically write statute to implement those line items. A lot of them are called conforming bills because they essentially rewrite existing state laws to conform with funding decisions that are made in the budget. So there's a bunch of these budget bills. And these budget bills are where the Florida legislature does an awful lot of its dirty work. There are a couple of reasons for this. The first, because these particular bills are tied directly to the state budget, they're a little different than regular bills in that they essentially get negotiated entirely in secret. And once they are written, they cannot be changed. So basically, the public doesn't get to see what's in these budget bills until it's too late to change anything. This is no way to run a railroad, folks, and yet it's the way the Florida legislature, a bunch of politicians in Tallahassee, have chosen to run the state for many, many years. So anyway, these budget bills are used for lots of last minute shenanigans in Tallahassee, and sometimes it's silly stuff. Like last year, there was a Republican state senator from the Orlando area who used the budget implementing bill to try and stop communities around Florida, local governments around Florida, from regulating gas-powered leaf blowers. There's it's like more than 1 million people in Florida who don't have health insurance, but we had time to try and focus on who gets to regulate when and how gas leaf blowers can be used. But sometimes it is a lot more serious than that. So this year, for instance, Republican leaders in Tallahassee used one of their budget bills to slip through a giant expansion of this controversial school privatization program. It's called the Schools of Hope program, and it basically gives tens of millions of dollars in kind of bonus taxpayer subsidies to charter school operators that move into certain zones where it's attendance zones of poorer performing schools. Remember that Schools of Hope bill, by the way, because we're going to be diving more deeply into that one soon. Um, but that was the hardly the only thing that got slipped at the last minute into these budget bills. You might remember a few months ago there was a big controversy at Florida A&M University when Ron DeSantis and his appointees arranged to have a telecom lobbyist hired as the new president of Florida's only public historically black university. And this was over the objections, like really intense objections from a lot of alumni and students at this school. Um, well, in addition to getting this telecom lobbyist that job, they also used one of the budget bills the Florida legislature and the governor's office did to help fund a nearly $900,000 pay package for her. They needed to tweak a little bit of state law to make that happen, and the way they did it was they came in through the back door at the last minute through one of these budget bills. You have probably seen, if you follow Florida politics even a little bit closely, that Ron DeSantis has been jetting all over the state lately, sort of cosplaying as Elon Musk and threatening to doge a bunch of local governments around the state. He's been demanding that cities and counties turn over thousands of pages of records and give them access to their facilities and their computer systems, and vowing that he and his team are going to ferret out all sorts of wasteful spending by local governments. It is more than a little ironic coming from a governor who just pissed away more than $200 million in taxpayer money to build an illegal immigrant prison camp in the middle of the Everglades that may have to close 2 months after it opened. Or a governor, by the way, if you're here in Orlando, who's been paying state troopers to hang out all day at a Dunkin' Donuts near downtown Orlando just so they can make sure nobody comes along and tries to chalk a rainbow on the sidewalk. But anyway, Ron DeSantis is going around the state making local governments, like I said, give them access to their data systems, turn over just thousands of pages of records. And he's able to do all this because of another last minute provision that got slipped into the budget implementing bill, one that allows him essentially to fine any local elected officials or local officials who do not give him the records and the access he wants for this stuff. Um, and then there was yet another provision that got slipped into this year's budget implementing bill, a provision that was buried on page 143 of what was a 154 page piece of legislation, and dealing with so-called, quote, media reliability and bias monitors. Basically, what this section of the bill, of this budget bill, says is that state agencies are not allowed to contract with any businesses that use the services of any kind of firm that rates news organizations based on their accuracy or based on their ethics or their record on peddling misinformation. And this is specifically intended to squeeze companies like NewsGuard Technologies. NewsGuard is a 7-year-old startup that was co-founded by a former Wall Street Journal publisher that evaluates news organizations across the spectrum based on essentially their accuracy and their adherence to journalistic standards. So, and NewsGuard produces these credibility scores and ratings on a 0 to 100 scale, and these ratings are used by clients like search engines, AI developers, news aggregators, and a number of like brand-sensitive businesses that are really that don't want their ads showing up on like disreputable sites peddling in misinformation. And so, like I said, this provision attacking NewsGuard and other media bias monitors didn't show up until the very end of session. Like literally the first time we saw it in the budget bill was on the final Friday night of session this year. And of course, there was no explanation whatsoever of where this idea had come from. Now, there had been a standalone bill that had been filed earlier in session that had the exact same language. And it was pretty clear that this stuff that showed up in this budget bill at the last minute had just been basically copy-pasted from this standalone bill that had been filed. And that bill was House Bill 1449, but it had never moved. It never got a single public hearing, never got a single vote. The House of Representatives does have these rules that say that require lobbyists to disclose any specific bills or issues that they are lobbying members on, but nobody at all registered to lobby on this House Bill 1449, so there were no clues there. And so the origins of this essentially attack on NewsGuard was something of a mystery. And so I decided to do a public records request about it. And I should say, honestly, it's not that I thought that this was such a big deal. Like, I mean, to be completely honest, I kind of sort of looked at this issue as one of these like like a carnival barker bill, basically yet another kind of like silly right-wing pandering exercise. There's lots of particularly far-right media with less than reliable histories when it comes to facts, who all claim that the problem isn't their reporting, it's all the fact checkers that are biased against them. And I sort of looked at it as like pandering to that kind of crowd. Just generally, I didn't really think of it as a serious policy. It's kind of, this is the same legislature that's in recent years passed bills pretending to cancel chemtrails or banning windmills that don't exist. But also, this kind of professionally pissed me off, just as someone who takes journalism very seriously. I mean, after all, somebody did want this. It didn't just sort of like walk into a budget bill all by itself. And any kind of news outlet that is afraid of fact checking is no kind of news outlet at all. Listen, there are plenty of people that don't like the issues I choose to focus on or disagree with the sort of where I land or the angle I come at issues from. But you could put anything I write under a microscope and it will hold up. And if I do make a mistake, I correct it, like anybody who cares about their credibility would. So anyway, I went pursuing a public records request on it, and the records request came back a few weeks ago, and it almost missed. It didn't really, at first glance, it didn't really seem to turn a whole lot up. And this is partly because when I first sort of made the records request, I kind of had a theory I had a guess as to where this language might have come from, and that theory I think turned out to be way off. But the request did turn up this one interesting document. It was an internal bill tracking spreadsheet maintained by Representative John Snyder. This is a Republican from Stewart down on the Atlantic coast, Florida's Atlantic coast, and the guy who had sponsored that standalone bill, House Bill 1449. That was the bill that had never actually moved, but had later been copy-pasted into one of these budget bills at the very last minute. That spreadsheet listed out every single bill John Snyder was sponsoring during this year's session, and importantly, the lobbyists he was working with on each one. And the spreadsheet showed that Snyder had worked on House Bill 1449 with a lobbyist at one of Florida's biggest firms. And one of that firm's clients was Newsmax. Now, remember that the House, I mentioned earlier, the House has these rules that say any lobbyist that's going to lobby a member on a specific bill or specific issue has to disclose that specific bill or issue for the public to see. And this is as much, honestly, for legislative leadership to get as much information as possible and see who's working what. But it's helpful. It's a valuable service to the public too, to try and get some sort of indication of what is happening behind the scenes and who is driving what bills and who is really moving the agenda in the legislature. But again, no lobbyist had ever disclosed working on House Bill 1449. So after I found this spreadsheet, I started asking a few questions of the House about why no one had ever disclosed, whether or not there was a missing disclosure here, and whether or not the House was going to do anything about it. Honestly, this took a little bit more escalation than it probably should have. But eventually, two lobbyists acknowledged that, lo and behold, they had lobbied on that budget bill on behalf of Newsmax. Now, if you are not a regular consumer of MAGA media, you may not realize how big Newsmax has become. So this was a cable operation or a cable news company that was founded by a friend of Donald Trump's. It's based in Boca Raton. And while it began as kind of like this tiny, lo-fi, low-budget looking operation, it has grown enormously particularly since the 2020 presidential election, when Newsmax was, shall we say, not particularly careful or rigorous when it came to repeating bogus conspiracy theories about the election being stolen. In fact, just over the last few months, Newsmax has agreed to pay more than $100 million to settle libel suits stemming from defamatory statements it aired repeatedly in the aftermath of the 2020 presidential election. But despite its, shall we say, loose grip on reality, Newsmax today is huge. It is now one of the country's top cable news networks. The company says it reaches more than 40 million Americans each month. It just went through an IPO. It's now publicly traded, and you can see it generates more than $100 million in advertising revenue each year. But it also turns out that Newsmax has been complaining about NewsGuard for years. Partially, this is because Newsmax scores a particularly paltry 20 out of 100 on NewsGuard's credibility ratings. And Newsmax executives have essentially complained that the low scores from NewsGuard drives away some advertisers. So apparently, Newsmax decided to hire some lobbyists in Tallahassee and use the Florida legislature to go after NewsGuard. By the way, it turns out this may not be the first time that Newsmax tried to lobby for a law like this in Florida, and nor may it have been the first time it tried to cover its lobbying tracks in the Florida Capitol. So there was actually a similar bill filed during the 2024 session. It wasn't exactly the same, and it never passed. But the main guy promoting it was a guy by the name of Jimmy Patronis, who's a Republican from the Panhandle. He was Florida's chief financial officer, but he recently got elected to U.S. Congress in the special election to fill Matt Gaetz's congressional seat. And whenever Jimmy Patronis would kind of chirp online about this bill or yap about it in a hearing or at a press conference or something, he would specifically attack NewsGuard. And so it was clear last year that there was this bill to go after NewsGuard. And like I said, it didn't pass. So I don't even know if I ever even wrote about it on the newsletter in any form. But after coming into these records, after learning that Newsmax was behind this year's bill, I decided to go back through the records around the 2024 legislation just to see if I could find anything. And it turns out the lobbying records for that 2024 bill included this one random lobbyist who claimed his client on the bill was a guy by the name of Trey Radel. And Trey Radel, if you don't know that name, he is a former member of Congress, I think from South Carolina, who ended up resigning after he was arrested buying cocaine. And Trey Radel does some lobbying himself. And it turns out he was also registered to lobby the Florida legislature during the 2024 session, and he had exactly one client, Newsmax. So what you had was a situation where there was a lobbyist registered on this bill going after NewsGuard who claimed his client was another lobbyist whose only client was Newsmax. So I actually reached out to Trey Radel and this other lobbyist to ask if, like, were we doing a bit of client masking here for we're trying to hide Newsmax's fingerprints on this stuff. They did not respond. I mentioned earlier this law that passed this year in this budget bill. It appears to be a first of its kind law in the country, state law in the country. There have been several Republican members of Congress and in the Trump administration that have used their positions to try and attack NewsGuard, and they've often landed some pretty fluff coverage on NewsGuard while they do it. But Florida is the first state to actually pass a law, as far as I can tell. I should also say that Newsmax declined to answer any specific questions about its lobbying efforts in Tallahassee, although it did say it was pleased that the Florida legislature passed this bill and cracked down on what it called censorship, quote unquote censorship. And this is part of like a common complaint or claim that Newsmax makes, and that NewsGuard and other fact checkers are biased against conservative media. But actually, well, Newsmax seems to fare very poorly when evaluated for accuracy and ethics. There are plenty of other conservative publications that are more journalistically rigorous, and they do just fine under NewsGuard's rating. So, for instance, the National Review and Washington Examiner, they both get a 92.5 out of 100 on NewsGuard's ratings. The Daily Caller, which was founded a news site founded by Tucker Carlson, they get an 82. I mean, Fox News actually scores higher than under NewsGuard's metrics than MSNBC. It's neither one of them should be too thrilled with their rating. I think Fox News is at 69.5, whereas MSNBC is at 49.5. But still, there is clearly no bias against conservative media. There's a bias against irresponsible and inaccurate media. And just to sort of give you a sense of the quality of journalism we're talking about here, Newsmax has actually celebrated this new Florida law on air. So shortly after Governor Ron DeSantis signed the budget bill that included this stuff in it into law, the network ran a fairly lengthy segment basically hailing Florida leaders for what they called, quote, a groundbreaking move. There was an anchor who was like heaping praise by name on Ron DeSantis, on House Speaker Danny Perez and Senate President Ben Albritton. A guest on the segment called the new law, a quote, a huge deal. They never once mentioned that Newsmax itself lobbied for it. And I want to end with one point about this. I mentioned earlier that I initially kind of looked at this as kind of a silly issue. I looked into it mostly out of professional curiosity, but it was mostly sort of viewed as just, like I said earlier, right-wing pandering. This is just yet another MAGA sideshow in Tallahassee. But as I was going through the process of writing the story, because like I said earlier, we posted this. We posted a story about this online earlier on the newsletter, and that's kind of like how I do a lot of my thinking. The writing process is helps me sort of think through issues. And as I did that, it sort of occurred to me that this was actually a much bigger deal and a much more sort of outrageous thing to have done than I sort of initially appreciated. It's actually one of the grossest forms of rent seeking you can find. You basically, what we had here was one private company using its influence in the Florida legislature to try and hurt another private company. And of course, Ron DeSantis and Danny Perez and the other Republicans who run the Florida legislature were so thirsty for attention from conservative media that they went right along with this with, like, in most cases, with no questions asked whatsoever. They were happy to be used. You know, the next time you hear a Republican member of the Florida legislature claiming to support the free market, feel free to laugh in their face. That has become the biggest lie in Tallahassee at this point. And with that little bit of outrage, we'll probably leave it there. Just as a quick reminder, if you can, click like and subscribe and maybe leave a review. As I said earlier, that helps grow the show. And then if you haven't already and are interested, please think about signing up for a newsletter or a subscription to the actual newsletter too. The easiest place to find us is at seekingrentsfl.com. Like I said, subscriptions are free. Nothing's behind a paywall, but there is that option to voluntarily pay for a subscription if you value the work and if you've got the means. And with that out of the way, we'll be back again very soon. Take care.